So we know from the Bad Batch the Empire pretty much immediately started phasing out the clone troopers, replacing them with recruited stormtroopers, TK troopers. But how long did it take to actually phase out the entirety of the clone army? Well, today we're going to discuss that, and there actually is a canon answer to this, so let's just dive right in with that. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. Now, it's common knowledge that the Empire replaced the clone troopers that had seen combat during the Clone Wars with recruited soldiers, and there's tons of information out there. Hell, I've done several videos on why they made this decision, so we're not going to focus too much on that today, and instead talk about the timeline, what this process looks like, because while the Bad Batch makes it look almost instantaneous, there's actually a bit more complex of a reality to that. So let's start with the beginning of this process. We know that shortly after the end of the Clone Wars, the Empire began Project Warmantle, which saw the clone troopers being replaced by recruited stormtroopers of the TK Trooper variety. These initial batches of stormtroopers were trained by clone commandos, which were some of the most effective infantry forces utilized by the Grand Army of the Republic. Now, while watching the Bad Batch, one could be mistaken for thinking that they pretty much immediately replaced all combat troops with recruited soldiers. We see pretty quickly, at least by the end of Season 1, that most combat forces of the Empire appear to be TK troopers by this point, but that might be a bit misleading. It's likely that the Empire quickly shifted over to using TK troopers for offensive operations or high-value combat operations, and began shifting clone troopers to logistical, secondary, and defensive roles, mainly on outposts that were not considered crucial to Imperial security. As a result, the clone troopers didn't disappear immediately. Well, they did pretty quickly stop producing more clone troopers and solidify that decision when they destroyed Tapoka City on Kamino. It would be a while before they would completely phase them out. But yeah, the first phase of this process was removing them from combat roles, which is what we see in the Bad Batch. Most of the time when Imperial forces are responding to heists, attacks, or assaults on Imperial facilities, the response is not a group of Imperial clone troopers, but instead groups of TK troopers possibly supported or led by clone commandos, who were now being used as squad commanders for more valuable Imperial units. For example, when the Empire cracked down on the resistance operating out of Pabu, they sent TK troopers, which the Empire viewed as the future of their infantry force, into combat for a few reasons. Number one, they had a lot of faith that TK troopers were well trained, having been trained by Republic commandos, but they also probably wanted these soldiers to get some combat experience, so pushing them to the forefront is a sensible decision, especially when you have a large number of them. So if the clone troopers didn't disappear right away, how long did it take? Well, the actual canon answer, and the number, if you're just here for the number, here's the answer. About 5 or 6 years for them to be primarily removed from most roles. A few of them did stick around, and we'll talk about those exceptions in a bit, but about 5 years after the end of the Clone Wars is when we really see the last Imperial clone units be nearly completely replaced. Clone troopers were primarily pushed into backwater roles, or, interestingly, very high casualty roles, with the idea of thinning out their numbers so they could more easily justify replacing entire units at once by simply reducing the number of clones available to that unit. So for most of the time that the clone troopers were serving the Galactic Empire, they were pushed to the background. They were operating on backwater bases in places where they didn't really see the light of day very much, instead basically just playing defensive roles. And also keep in mind that they could be aged out far quicker than regular soldiers. These clone troopers had an accelerated aging system built into them, so while this did mean that the clone troopers could age up to the age where they could be effective combat units quicker, it meant that they were effective combat units for a shorter amount of time because they would quickly age out of that age range where they would be good soldiers. But I did mention that a few of them did stick around longer. We know that some clone troopers stayed on to train Imperial stormtroopers and even Imperial officers for many years. We know that there was at least one still in service with the Galactic Empire at the time of the Battle of Yavin, 20 years, or I guess 18 years, after the end of the Clone Wars, which is pretty impressive. Still, eventually they too would be retired, and while there may have been a handful of clones present in the Imperial military at the time of the Battle of Endor, I think that's incredibly unlikely. Those that we see in the Imperial military at the time of the Battle of Yavin are already nearly too old to continue training soldiers. And it's also worth mentioning that clone troopers training recruited soldiers hated that job. They despised the recruited soldiers that they viewed as their replacements and were often seen as inferior in combat, so they wouldn't really enjoy that job either, which is just a recipe for problems. So, eventually, by the time of the original trilogy, for the most part, clone troopers are completely gone from Imperial ranks. But it wasn't as instantaneous as the Bad Batch would make you believe. That being said, there's a lot of criticism over that decision that the Empire made to replace the clone troopers with stormtroopers. The clone troopers seem remarkably effective in combat, and stormtroopers seem incompetent. If you'd like to learn more about why the Empire made that decision, I'll leave a link up here to my video breaking down the differences between clone troopers and stormtroopers, and why the Empire chose to replace the clone troopers. And I'd like you to let me know down in the comments whether you think it was a good idea to move the clone troopers from a frontline position to a reserve position. Obviously, you want to get your recruited soldiers some combat experience, but they are less effective in combat than the clone troopers were. So, do you think it makes more sense to push the clone troopers to the back to give the new guys a chance to fight an actual battle, or do you think it makes more sense to keep the clone troopers on the front because they're the most effective in combat? And if you have anything else you'd like to see me cover in Star Wars, you can let me know down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.